So in this video, I'll just go over some of the basics from the Kant reading. So to lay a few things out, first of all, what sort of moral approach or approach to morality is Kant? Remember utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. What that meant was that, any act that is anything that we do, to judge it morally as being a good or a bad act is entirely a matter of judging its results or consequences. That's why it's called consequentialism. So, utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism in that it says that the moral value of an act depends upon its consequences. And the consequences that matter for utilitarianism are the impacts on human happiness. If the impact is overall good, that is, it increases human happiness, or decreases it to the least possible extent, or something like that, some variation, then it's a good act. Kantianism is really total contradiction of that. Again, we have an act, something that somebody does. And sure, there are consequences. But for Kant, those consequences are entirely irrelevant to its moral value. That is, for Kant, the consequences or results of an act are not the basis upon which we judge its moral value. As Kantians, we would have to go back prior to the act and ask what is its motive or intent. It is not judged on the basis of its results. It's judged on the basis of the motive or intent behind the act. That is, what is it that prompted the act? And Kant's idea in this reading is that we already know this. That is, the consequences of an act matter practically, of course. And certainly we would rather have things work out so that people are generally happy. But that's not morality. Morality is different. And morality is about the intent behind an act. So one of the things you can say, it's a cliche, but for Kant, it's the thought that counts, not the result. And if anything can give a human act, anything that we do, I mean by an act, moral worth, it's got to be the motive behind it. And he says the motive that actually is necessary in order to give an act any moral worth is goodwill. So if an act is prompted by a will that is good, Kant says, then it's a good act. It has moral worth. Any act that's determined by let's say a desire or want, or what he calls inclination, if that is what determines an act, then the act has no moral worth whatsoever. I mean, it doesn't mean it's a bad act. It just means it has no moral worth. It could never be said to be praiseworthy. And that's not just things that are kind of obvious, like, well, if I'm hungry and that makes me eat, it's not a bad thing, but it's nothing that has any moral worth. If the inclination behind the act is something like love or sympathy, and if it makes me do something for somebody else, for Kant, that means it has no moral worth, because there's only one thing that can give an act moral worth, and that's a goodwill. So the immediate question is, what is a goodwill? What is it that makes a will good? And he has an answer to that. And he says, again, this is just him bringing out what we already know. This whole thing is just, from Kant's point of view, this is merely an analysis of our already existing intuitive grasp of what morality is. What is it that makes a will good? When do we know when the will is good? if you do something out of duty, then the act is good. Then the act has moral worth. Any other motive, and the act doesn't have moral worth. And this notion of duty couldn't be more important for your understanding of Kant's philosophy. Duty is what is duty? Duty is obligation. If I have a duty to do something, it means I'm obliged to do it, and that's a very important part of Kant's philosophy. Is that moral acts are things that we are obliged to do, that we have to do. We have to do the right thing, and it doesn't matter if it makes us unhappy. It doesn't even matter if it makes other people unhappy. If you are obliged to do it, then you've got to do it. So this brings up a further question, because duty, there's no such thing as free-floating duty. If you have a duty, you always have a duty to something. So what is he talking about? Duty to what? And that's where I think we get to almost the end of the line, because there has to be an answer to that which is sufficient to account for obligation. That is, what we're asking is what has the kind of authority over me that it can lay obligations on me, that it can lay upon me duties. And that's not such an easy thing to find. That is, what is it that has that kind of stature or status for me that it can oblige me to do something, even if that something would make me unhappy? And Kant says there's an answer to that, and it's built into our ordinary grasp, pre-philosophical grasp of morality, and that's the moral law. The only thing that I have, let's say, immediate respect for, it's the moral law. So this leads to the second part of the reading, which is about the categorical imperatives, of which you only have to pay attention to the first two. And the first one, which is act only so that your maxim or your rule of action can serve as a law for everyone. It comes right out of that respect for law. What Kant says is built into our thinking. It is absolutely what he would say a priori. Prior to our experience, once we become reasonable creatures, we recognize that our actions must be lawful. And that whatever we do, our rule of action, we must be able to will that everyone do the same thing in the same circumstances. If we can't will that, that is, if we find that our maxim of action is not, we can't universalize it like that, then we have to not do it, or at least recognize that if we were to do it, it would be morally wrong. The second categorical imperative has to do with persons. And it says that we must always treat persons as ends in themselves, never as a mere means, to one of our ends. This is a very, very important part of Kantian moral philosophy, at least as important as the respect for law is the respect for persons. And the idea underlying this imperative, this order, that's what an imperative is. It's an order or command. And to say that it's categorical is to say that there are no conditions or exceptions. But what underlies the second version of the categorical imperative is the idea that persons or people have intrinsic worth. Everything else in the world is a thing. That is, a thing can only have relative worth. Everything else, having only relative worth, has worth if someone finds it worthy. That is, if someone wants it, someone desires it, someone values it. But something has intrinsic worth something has intrinsic worth if its worth does not depend on anyone's valuing it. So this is Kant's idea that we all intuitively know that a person is the only thing in the world that is not a simple thing. That is, we all recognize that we have duties to persons because persons are intrinsically valuable and we are persons ourselves. Persons, crucially for Kant, are rational creatures. And this is the key, right? He does say that, we have to treat humanity as an end in itself, but he says we have to treat humanity as an end in itself because humanity is rational. He also recognizes that there's a possibility that there are non-human rational creatures who also would have to be treated in accord with the second categorical imperative. So, yeah, it's a pretty amazing idea, a pretty important idea. Perhaps that the whole of morality depends on the idea of a person, that is, a being in the world whose worth is intrinsic, objective, and absolute.